Well, I would like to highlight the fact that we have heard from some speakers, notably some of our European friends, Lars Hedegaard, Geert Wilders, discuss Islam, not radical Islamism, not Islamist movements and things like that. And I think that I would like to offer some food for thought here, which is that one of the bases, or perhaps the basis of control that Islam uses against people is Islamic slander law, which prohibits criticism of Islam, and of course the death penalty for leaving Islam, apostasy. That's a pretty big control. And I think, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I've talked about it with many of you over the years. I do believe that when we and some of our most fiery, passionate leaders, political leaders, persist in discussing Islamism and radical Islam, and most of the fighting right, you might say, subscribes to this as well. I believe that we are operating under Islamic slander law that prohibits the criticism of Islam. And when you hear someone like Lars or Geert Wilders and some of the others actually speak about Islam, it is simple, it is also defensible. And when we go back to the language of radical Islam, I think the implication is always that there is some regular Islam that has a regular Quran and a regular Sharia and a regular prophet that is okay and completely compatible, and all the measures that we want to take to protect ourselves or to fight against these incursions into our own liberties, we're always completely still shadowboxing with this fantasy notion. And I say it's fantasy only because the books are there to prove it, as Noni Darwish mentioned earlier. So I just put it out there for somebody to think about, because I know everyone here really, really wants to get at this and move this forward. And I think we have a lot to learn from some of our European friends and others.
Steve Coughlin.
Thank you. I'd like to kind of write in on that draft. We had someone talk earlier about the fact that Sisi stood before Al-Azhar and called out the violent extremist, radical extremist, violent people, fundamentalists. I could keep going here. He did not do that. He went to Al-Azhar and he told the imams at Al-Azhar, and that is as doctrinal and mainstream as it gets, that they are responsible for what's going on, not calling them radical, but recognizing that their tradition, meaning Islam to date, is, I think as he sees it, going to destroy the Muslim world. But in doing that, he didn't call them radical. He called them who they are. And the blind sheikh was brought up earlier. His only status is that his status as an imam from Al-Azhar. Qawadari is from Al-Azhar. Azam, who founded the Muslim Al-Qaeda, is from Al-Azhar. We've heard phrases like radical Islamic extremist, extreme Sharia, fundamentalist, which if I could, when you use the word fundamentalist, which is actually a term that only applies to a 20th century Protestant Christian movement, you're allowing that word to be used against Christians in the future, because there's no such thing as fundamentalist Islam, okay, and a whole lot of other language. What you're doing is you're denying the fact that Islam is what it is. Now, I understand the tactics of it, but here's the thing. One of the reasons I use Reliance of the Traveler is because at the very beginning of the book, it says it was approved by Al-Azhar. And then you go to another page and you get the triple hit. It said it was approved by the American Muslim Brotherhood, which is everybody, anybody in this government and media talk to. Okay? It was signed also by, he also signed that in his capacity representing a school in, or a center in Saudi Arabia, so it also represents Saudi buy-in. But most important, that entity he signed off on their name, I think it's the, I can't remember what it is in Riyadh or Jeddah, that is the OIC's subordinate element that does Sharia law, so that we know when we quote Reliance of the Traveler, it represents the prevailing view of Sunni Islam, period. So if I can take a quote out of that book, it is Islam, as is understood by everybody you talk to. So if you think, so when you decide you're going to call this extreme radical, you've already submitted. If you're, I understand the tactics of it. that you have to bring people along. But if you're basically saying, as some people are, radical Islamic extremists, they're extremely correct. They're violently correct. And that is why the moderates can't get a hand in there. That's why they're all over here.
Right, thank you, David. And you know, there is no coincidence that it happens to be the city of Dearborn, which has the largest Muslim population. It was in 2012, actually, this group of Christian missionaries who go around and evangelize throughout the country went to the Arab Festival, had signs, they walk on the sidewalk, and they were literally attacked, stoned in the city street by an angry mob of Muslims. I mean, you can see this video on our website. The video went viral. And you have to pause for a minute and say, is what I'm watching here happened on a city street of the United States of America? I mean, it's absolutely, it was unreal. But even more so, at the end of the video, you'll see the Wayne County Sheriff's Department, and they bragged that they had the largest law enforcement presence ever at the Arab Festival that year. They had, I think it was 34 officers, 19 reserve officers, and a horse-mounted force of 6, larger than they had for the Super Bowl, larger when the President of the United States come. Well, they had this gang of miscreant teens literally throwing stones and bruising these Christians, and the Wayne County Sheriff's Department pulled them over at the end, and they gave the Christians an ultimatum. They told the Christians that if they did not leave the Arab Festival, they would be arrested for disorderly conduct. They didn't arrest one of those bottle throwers who was engaging in criminal acts. Well, we sued under the Civil Rights Statute, First Amendment. The federal judge in Michigan ruled against us, and he held that the violence justified the police essentially suppressing the free speech rights of Christians. I mean, pause and think about that for a minute. I mean, it's called the heckler's veto in First Amendment jurisprudence. It turns the First Amendment on its head. We appealed to the Sixth Circuit. I argued the case for a 3-judge panel, and they affirmed 2-1. The dissenting judge wrote a scathing dissent. And it was scathing, and rightfully so. He said, not only is this decision wrong, it is dangerously wrong. And when you have a judge calling out his colleagues that way, and he made the point to say, look, the state should not be in the business of enforcing blasphemy laws. I mean, he said that in his opinion. We did a petition for a hearing en banc, meaning a full court, and any lawyer here knows how rare those are, and it was granted. It was granted this past October. So I'm going to be re-arguing this case, very important case for First Amendment rights. I mean, even to have it granted en banc, the standard is it was a precedent-setting error of exceptional public importance. So a majority of the judges in the Sixth Circuit granted en banc review, and I'm going to be re-arguing this case March 4th to a panel of 15 federal court judges. So I mean, this is real. This threat on our free speech, and that's just one of many examples that we have. And Frank, when we opened this session, talked about the Muslim Brotherhood, and the explanatory memorandum, and how they their goal is to subvert us by our own hands. And we see they're using our laws, right? Because the problem we have with Islam, in here from a legal perspective, is obviously it's cloaked in protections under the Civil Rights Act and cloaked under protection under the First Amendment. And so dealing with those issues can be very difficult. Just one other quick example, another one happened in Michigan. One of the things that we see happening, and I think it ties in with David's study about how the mosques become centers for the jihadists, is that we see CARE and these other organizations going around the country and purchasing property in residential communities, and then going to the zoning board and say, we want to put a mosque here, knowing that there's going to be a zoning issue. They have to get the zoning laws modified for that. And when the city says no, we're not going to allow this zoning to take place for traffic concerns or anything else, what is it? It's automatically Islamophobe, and they sue them under a federal statute called RILUPA, the Religious Land Use Institutionalized Persons Act, and they drag the city into the litigation. And we just had represented several citizens showed up at one of these zoning board hearings who lived in the neighborhood. Who said, "Look, this is going to create traffic problems for our kids. This isn't right to build a mosque in our residential neighborhood." Well, what did CARE do? CARE subpoenaed everyone who spoke out at that public hearing with harassing subpoenas, asking for private emails, commanding that they appear at depositions. We got contacted by 7 of them, and we filed what's called the motions to quash. And thankfully, our federal judge in Michigan granted those, which meant they, got rid of the subpoenas, and they awarded us attorney's fees as a result. But this sort of thing is going on, throughout the country, and they're using our laws, the Constitution, and the civil rights statutes against us.
Rob, we appreciate what you and David do.
This is a bridge too far for me, and maybe I come at this from a different perspective, because the first Muslim I got to know well was not a terrorist. It was the informant that we inserted into the terrorist organization, without whom we could not have stopped the attacks. And I don't think anybody has been stronger than I have on the idea that we have to understand the enemy's ideology. But the thought that we have to take on whether the enemy's ideology is the true Islam or not, under circumstances where a religion is not simply a doctrine, and a belief system is not simply a doctrine, it's a combination of the doctrine and the way that the doctrine is practiced. I think if the message is going to be ISIS is Islam and Islam is ISIS, then we are antagonizing a lot of people who should and would otherwise be on our side. And I don't think that taking that position means that you're opening the door to Muslim Brotherhood taqiyya, because we do have, and this is the reason we've concentrated so much on Sharia, we do have a mechanism and a metric to divide the people who are dangerous to the United States from the people who aren't dangerous to the United States. And frankly, I must say, I couldn't care less whether Zuhdi Jasser's Islam is the true Islam or Baghdadi's Islam is the true Islam. I have my own view, and I think it's the view that most people in this room share, about the doctrine and the literal doctrine, and the fact that it's very hard for the moderates to get any traction because they're like the guys dancing on a head of a pin, and the terrorists are the ones who are literalists. And to the extent they're extreme, it's because they're extremely literal about what the doctrine is. But their intramural dispute is of no consequence to me. I mean, we have a ton of intramural disputes in Christianity. We have it in other religions as well. The only thing that makes any difference, I think, to us outside of winning the academic point is who is a threat to the national security of the United States. And if we can get to a point where we have a metric for measuring that and we hammer the people who are a threat to the United States, who the hell cares whether they're right or wrong about Islam? I just don't understand why we need to bite that off.
Clare Lopez.
Going back to a point that Andy made, and I think he's exactly right. Any of us who are not Muslim, we really don't have any standing to say what is Islam or what is not Islam. We can read the text, we can read the doctrine, we know what the doctrine says. But I think in the final analysis, what we need to do is place the responsibility on the Muslim community. They need to say, I am faithful to Sharia or I am not. It's not for us to say if they're faithful or not faithful. If they do not speak up and do not say, I take exception to jihad, I will not be a supremacist, I will not hate Jews, if they don't say that out loud and publicly, then we are left to say, well, then we give you full credit for being a faithful Muslim, and a faithful Muslim is one who believes in these things, and we know what the doctrine is. So we place the responsibility on the Muslim community and the individuals in it to say what they are or what they are not. It's not for us to say. But if they do not speak up and they do not say these things, I oppose Sharia apostasy laws, then we have no other recourse really but to give them full credit for believing the doctrine of their own faith and for being faithful to it.
You know, I couldn't agree more when we say we identify the threat and we go out and hammer them. And that's what I've been trying to do for the better part of 50-some-odd years. However, you got to face facts. You know, today, we got a Henry Wallace in the White House. In my view, Wallace was a communist. But what we have today is an Islamist. And when our military, if we unleashed them, could carry out the task that we all hoped they would do, but they're restricted. the restricted rules of engagement that we're in. It's a signal that we're not really serious. The 7 to 10 airstrikes a day we're doing against ISIS, it's an embarrassment. You're giving air power a bad name. It just isn't going to happen. So, you know, while we say we got 23 more months with this administration, and just to say, well, we got to try and put bounds on it through hearings and so forth and all of that to me is sort of abrogates some of the responsibilities that are in our Constitution. And that's why I asked Speaker Gingrich if there any courage to start censor procedure. Unless you do something to fire, to hold, to stake out your ground, we're going to continue to lose this battle. And there are no bounds on this administration as it now stands.
Steve Coughlin.
I would just like to clarify a couple points, and that is this. I personally do not make any judgments about what individual Muslims believe or don't believe, and I'm perfectly prepared to understand that a vast majority, or at least a large number of them, don't buy into the positions. As an individual, I may have no standing to say whether someone is a proper Muslim or not, but as a national security intelligence officer, I have a duty to make a call about who constitutes a national threat and who doesn't. And we take a look at what that doctrine is, and we assess the relevant combat power capable of being projected from the institutional understanding, which is the doctrinal understanding, which these people have behind them from Al-Azhar, and we have the moderates who do not have a basis. And so when we take a look at how we're going to orient on the enemy, we are not orienting we're not, with the moderate group, we have people who lack the foundation to sustain an assault inside their own domain. I mean, I put my life at the risk of a lot of Muslims just very recently, meeting with a lot of the Sisi's people. Okay, or people who are close to him, I should say. I support everything he's doing. He knows that what a lot of people don't know is the next day he had Al-Azhar imams come out and say what he said was apostasy. And when someone does an analysis of that, they have to say they're right. And we have to understand that they're right. And we have to understand that because it means, first of all, Sisi crossed the Rubicon in his own domain. There's no going back on that. And second of all, we support what he's doing, but we also have to understand that he's drawing on the current feeling inside Egypt that they just don't want to do that anymore. That's not moderate Islam, and we don't need to talk about it. We don't want to do it. And I'm all for that, so I think it's not good to use the words like moderate because you actually crouch those people out. You brand them moderate, that's what makes them get tagged by the Al-Azhar imams. Just let that argument go. But it's important. Personally, I don't have a stake. I completely agree with everything you said. But I also think from the combat power analysis point of view, when we look at what Zudi says along with what the Imam of Al-Azhar says in any century, and we say, wow, it's like that. We can't pretend that that doesn't make a difference, not in our personal opinions. I could care less. But it makes a difference in how we do an estimate of the threat and how to defeat them and what it will take. Well, I'll stop there.
And a duty to know, which is the subject of your forthcoming book, Catastrophic Failure. So watch this space for Steve Coughlin. Fred Fleitz?
Thanks, Frank. Fred Fleitz, Center for Security Policy. I guess I'd mostly associate with Zudi Jasser. I think we need to reach out to moderate Muslims like him and get Muslim groups to engage and to fight this battle. And he says he's the tip of the spear, and I agree with what he had to say. And I really didn't agree with most of what Geert Wilders had to say. But I'm still glad he said it, because the radical Muslims don't want us to hear him, because they want to kill him, so we won't hear what he has to say. And bear in mind that his colleague, Ali Hirsi Ali, who also was a member of parliament, had to flee the Netherlands because her life was in danger, because she tried to make a film about how women in Muslim countries are being mistreated, with Theo van Gogh, who was assassinated for making this film in 2004. So we may not agree with everything that Geert had to say, but we can't let him be silenced by people who are trying to silence him by violence. And so anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I just have a few points. I think from the ground level, and again, I stated early on, speaking to people, especially at the state, local, and county level, I think there is a great deal that can be done there, and I think the war is going to be won in this country at that level, because I believe at the federal level, our federal system, from the chief executive to the Department of Justice, specifically the Attorney General, and the leadership of Congress in both parties is failing, and the courts don't seem to be answering the mail either in some cases. So I think that the time for half measures is over. And I think as we talk about defeating this, I do believe it has to begin with a very rigorous and raw discussion of the threat, which is what I think we've done here. I think it's okay for us to disagree, but the biggest threat I see, which Charles not only alluded to, specifically stated, is there are even people that would say they're with us who live in this pink cloud unicorn world where we don't actually discuss reality because it's too scary. And that's okay. But those people just need to kind of move out of the way, because the big boys and girls need to deal with this, and this threat needs to be handled. I think a couple key parts of the strategy have to include dealing with the people, again, you mentioned this, Charles, who are aiding and abetting these people. And that means people like secretaries of DHS, FBI directors, police chiefs and sheriffs, and Christians like Rick Warren should have handcuffs on them. And I think when you start doing some of these things and charging them with actual chargeable and indictable crimes, so long as you can do that, then that will send a chill across. Now, it's not going to happen under this administration for sure, but that, I believe, needs to be a part of the strategy. And I don't know if Diana's over there, but during the Cold War, I believe we did go back and do that to some people even after they were out of office. I think that has to happen, because we need to send, going forward, a very clear message that it doesn't matter how high up in the government you are, when you've committed crimes like treason or conspiracy to overthrow the country, and you go out and you raise money like some members of Congress are doing, and like a particular Virginia congressman, and you go to Hamas functions and you get people, or you're a sheriff like the LA County Sheriff, and you raise money for Hamas, you should be held accountable for that in the legal process, so long as the legal process can support it. And when we're clear that Sharia is the threat, and Sharia is what they not only seek to impose, it's everything to them. So then a lot of these things, Deborah brought up the idea that they hate to lose. I mean, understanding that they don't do willy-nilly, and everything they do comes from and through the Sharia. I do not believe we have to work with the moderates. In almost 15 years, that's done nothing. In my experience inside and now outside the government, working with Muslims in the community who would like to help, the biggest problem is right now they can't. Because, for instance, inside the FBI, the only people the FBI are dealing with are Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and Muslim Brotherhood guys. So they don't want to become sources and assets. And while we do have some, there is a very limited number, and obviously the rules and restrictions on law enforcement are severe. But as a strategy, I think saying we need to work with them doesn't make sense to me, because it has not just because it hasn't proven itself to be worthy, but what it's done is it's delayed the process of us coming to an understanding of what the real threat is. And finally, I believe that any strategy, and I mentioned this at our meeting 5 weeks ago or whatever, I think any strategy has to begin with a national campaign that once again invigorates or reinvigorates an understanding of our founding doctrine and our founding principles. The idea that our liberty, our rights come from God. No man or government can take them from us. And that's why everything that flows both in our legal system and our moral principles comes out of that there's a God who gives life, and therefore life is valuable. And we have to honor that. One of George Washington's parting gifts to us was this quote, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. These will make you a greater and happy people than you are." And we shouldn't be afraid to talk like that because it's you're imposing your Christianity. The founders never said you had to be anything, but they said there has to be, in a constitutional republic, a moral framework, and they said it was the Scripture. It's the Bible, sacred Scripture. And what we want to take out of that is that's worked. And that was taught since the time we landed at Jamestown and the time we landed at have been here in this country, and we taught it. So I think until we get back to that and talk about the founding in the ideal of the Declaration, not just the Constitution, I think as it's been mentioned by several people, we're going to have a hard time because we need to understand what are we defending, because if it's not worth it, then defeating these guys doesn't necessarily make sense.